Welcome to Chess Dog, where players come to get stronger at chess. My name is John Montgomery, and today I have a really extraordinary game from a prodigy, 14 years of age, named Volodar Murzin. I'm apologizing for these pronunciations. His opponent, this is the World Cup, is Viorel Iordachescu. Volodar is 14. His opponent, Iordachescu, is 44. And Iordachescu had played in 7 World Cups before his young opponent was even born. And one amazing thing about this game is that the older player gets a nice advantage out of the opening. And the prodigy was in a worse position, but slowly but surely outplayed his opponent and played just a really nice game. An incredible game by a young player with a very promising future, and he also has the black pieces. So white begins with e4, and Volodar begins with the Caro-Kann defense. d4, d5, e5, the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann. This is similar to the advanced French, except that black can get that bishop at c8 into the game at f5, which he does immediately. White plays knight f3, e6, bishop e2, knight to e7. These are all very standard moves. c3, h6. The idea is to be able to tuck that bishop back to the h7 square. Castling, and knight to d7. Now, black wants to attack the base of the pawn chain. He wants to play the move c5 to put pressure on d4. White plays a4, and if allowed, he'll continue to gain space on the queen side with a4, a5, so black stops that immediately with a5. White plays knight to a3. The idea is he wants to play that knight to c2 and overprotect the d4 pawn. Black plays the bishop to h7. That frees up the f5 square for a piece. White plays knight to e1. And he does not play the knight to f5, but he plays the knight to g6. He wants to clear room for the bishop at f8 to develop. White plays bishop to d3, challenging that a7 bishop. Black develops. Knight a to c2, overprotecting the d4 pawn and potentially moving to e3 for more activity, maybe supporting an f4, f5 push. Castles, g3, preparing to play f4 or h4. Black plays c5, attacking the base of the pawn chain. h4, threatening to kick that knight at g6 all the way back to h8. Black goes ahead and plays c4. He releases the central tension, but kicks that light square bishop off the diagonal so that dark square bishop at h7 now is uncontested along that diagonal. Bishop e2, knight to b8. Now, this is a slow idea, and this allows white to set up an ideal kingside formation. And it is at this point that white really has an edge, and you might think that the more experienced player with a better position, more space, is going to be able to outplay his young opponent, but this is where things really begin to change. White plays knight to g2, black knight to c6, h5, kicking that knight to h8, sort of out of the position. Knight c to e3, can maneuver to g4, it can control f5, maybe supporting the f4, f5 pawn push. Queen to d7 to help defend that f5 pawn, f5 square, excuse me, through the e6 pawn. White plays f4. Now black plays f6, challenging the center and allowing that knight at h8 to reemerge on the f7 square. White takes, bishop takes, and white plays bishop to g4. And this is the beginning of the moment where black begins to turn the tide. Maybe a better move would have been f5, and then after that e6 pawn takes on f5, the knight g2 could go to f4, and white can pile up on that d5 pawn, and then white, I think, would have an advantage. Bishop g4 hits the e6 pawn, but it can be defended. And this is when things begin to turn. The knight comes to f7, begins to reactivate. White plays b3. So white wants to play on both sides of the board. C takes b3, queen takes b3. White wants to perhaps play c4 and put pressure on d5, put as much pressure on black's center and that d5 square as possible. Black plays the knight back to e7 so that that d5 square is protected and also the f5 square is under more control. The bishop goes to a3, pinning the knight to the rook. The bishop goes to e4. Of course, it's strong and centralized and also adds to the support of the d5 square. White plays queen to b5, offering the exchange of queens. A critical decision by young Volodar is to not exchange queens and play queen to c8 and put pressure on that c3 pawn. Rook a to c1, defending the pawn. Black plays rook to a6. This defends the e6 pawn laterally, but also prepares to go to c6 and double and put pressure on c3. Rook f to e1, putting potential pressure on e6, although right now the file is obviously blocked. Black plays knight to d6, hits the queen, adds to the control of c4, protects the bishop at e4, and at this point, Black has fought back and has now completely equalized. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't. So now that Black is equalized, the tide begins to really shift in his favor. Queen to e2, knight e to f5. Look how well placed Black's pieces are. The control of those light squares, the bishop at e4, the knight at f5. He's really beginning to find good squares, and he's threatening knight takes g3 right now. White defends with king to h2. Black plays rook to c6, threatening the c3 pawn. Queen to d2, defending that pawn. Black plays rook to e8, stepping out of that pin from that bishop on a3. The bishop takes at d6, the knight takes at d6, and now Black's advantage is becoming clearer. He has a safer king and the two bishops. Those are real advantages, not to mention the pressure he's got on that c3 pawn. The bishop comes back to h3. Now, b5. Black is creating an outside passed pawn to add to his advantages. This is really amazing chess from a 14-year-old. You really see a very mature approach to the game, slowly but surely accumulating small advantages and having those build up to a very strong position. White plays the knight to g4, hits that bishop at f6, but also can go into the e5 square. And it allows Black to go ahead and take on a4, knight 2 to e3, queen to d8, adds some defense to the a5 pawn, and supports the bishop at f6. The knight jumps into e5, rook to b6, grabbing the open file, rook to a1, threatening to take on a4, but queen to b8. Now Black is threatening rook to b7, pinning the queen to the king. White can't interpose with the knight because the bishop controls c7. He just played rook takes knight. The rook goes to e2 to stop that threat. Rook to b1. Now Black has penetrated into White's position, and Black has a winning advantage with those bishops, the pawns, everything. Black is now winning. White plays queen to a2, rook a1, queen to b3. Now both pawns are protected. The rook goes to a2, the hit a4. Black gives up the bishop pair. Bishop e5, de5. But now the knight can go to b5, hits the c3 pawn. Rook takes on a4, and Black doesn't retake on c3. Instead, he plays d4. Advances that pawn, and he can't play pawn takes pawn because the queen would take the knight at e3. Bishop to f1, hitting the knight at b5. Rook to c8, adding to the pressure to the c3 pawn, which still cannot take on d4. Rook to c4, rook c4, bishop c4, queen takes c3, counterattacking again that knight on e3, which is also threatened by the pawn. The bishop takes on e6 with check. Now, Black plays the king to f8. If instead he plays the king to h8, the bishop controls the g8 square, the pawn controls the g6 square, and that king wouldn't be able to get activated in an endgame. So it's a little bit risky, but he plays the king towards the center. Even though the queens are still on the board, he doesn't want that king to get trapped and unable to activate itself. White plays queen to a4, attacking that knight on b5. So black finds an interesting way to defend the knight at b5 and the pawn at a5. He plays queen to b2 check, king to h3, queen to b4, and offers the trade of queens. Now, if white trades queens, this is not a good endgame for white because of the passed pawns. One would be at b4, one would be at d4, but perhaps he could save it. By playing queen to d1, black is able to really bring the pressure. By the way, there's a little trap in this position, as there always seems to be in these games. If black takes on e3, queen to d8 would be checkmate. So remember, always be alert for those threats, even if you have a great position. Black plays the knight to c3, the queen goes to d2, and queen to b1, with the big threat of queen going to h1, and white's last mistake, queen takes d4. Now black has a forced checkmate. Can you see it? That's right. Queen to h1 check, king to g4, bishop to f3 check. The king is forced to f5, and then queen captures h5, checkmate. An amazing performance, a very mature performance from the 14-year-old Volodar Murzin, the young international master, a chess prodigy, and he's going into the next round of the World Cup. Thank you for joining us here at Chess Dog. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.